Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Matthew Jane, and I am the Learning and Engagement Manager for the State Historical Society of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Today, we'll hear from Craig Wright, Supervisory Archivist for the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library. Today's program focuses on the lives of Bert and Lou Hoover. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in just a few days. I've disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague, Jess Runlet, is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not have time to get to all the questions before we end today. And now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter for today. Before starting work at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in 2004, Craig Wright worked for the Minnesota Historical Society. Craig has degrees in Russian and East European Studies and Library Science from the University of Michigan. He has been an archivist for 35 years and spends most of his time at the library managing digitization projects. Files have been shared with people all over the world, including projects for researchers in Japan, England, Czechoslovakia, Kazakhstan, and Australia. And now he's with us here today. And now I'm happy to turn over to Craig to begin the webinar.
Thank you, Matthew and Jess. And thanks everyone for attending today. I was happy to talk about two what I consider very interesting people. There we go. So here is a picture that introduces you to most of the immediate family of Bert and Lou. This is election eve in 1928 at their mansion in Palo Alto. On the far left is their first son, Herbert Jr., his wife, Margaret. Lou Henry Hoover is holding their first male grandchild, who is Herbert Hoover III. Herbert Hoover is actually smiling. We don't have a lot of photographs of Herbert Hoover smiling, but he's holding his first grandchild, Margaret. And on the right-hand side is his second son, Alan Hoover, who is occasionally described as Washington's most eligible bachelor while the Hoovers were in office. Now, the president was, I'm an archivist and I read all the family letters, and we sort of feel like we have a little close knowledge of the family. Well, the family always called the president Bert. His son was always Herbert. And then legally, Herbert Hoover III. I met him. He was a very nice man. He sat in our lobby and fielded questions for fourth graders for 20 minutes one day. Anyway, he said they ran out of nicknames for Herbert, so they called him Pete after the family cat. These are the birthplace homes. On the left is Lou's house where she was born in Waterloo. It does not exist anymore. On the right-hand side is the little small cottage that Herbert Hoover was born. That's still on the site here. We're in a small national park that maintains the Quaker Meeting House and several other buildings. This photograph is before it actually belonged to the federal government. And as you'll notice, it says free to visitors. And the lady who owned it made her money by selling hot dogs for a dime. Lou Henry was born, so I'm starting with her because her birthday is in March. This is the 150th anniversary of the births of both, since they were both born in 1874. This year's, we are trying to do up the 150th anniversary of their births a little bit here. Her father, Charles Henry, was a bookkeeper at the First National Bank in Waterloo, and she was extremely close to her father. Her mother, Florence, developed chronic bronchitis, which caused the family to start moving around. First, they moved to a small town in southern Iowa. They were trying to find an environment that helped her with her bronchitis, and that didn't work, so they moved back to Waterloo. They moved to Texas briefly. That didn't work. They moved back to Waterloo. Then they tried Kansas, and that didn't work out either. But instead of going back to Waterloo, they kept going until they hit California, where the family settled. Um, Lou originally attended Los Angeles Normal School. Normal schools is where the teachers would be educated. Her family moved to Monterey after her sophomore year. So after her sophomore year, she transferred to San Jose Normal School. Los Angeles Normal School is UCLA today, and San Jose Normal School is San Jose State University, where she graduated. We'll talk a little bit about her second college career in a little bit. After she graduated, first she worked as a bank, tried to work in a bank to follow the footsteps of her father. She soon realized that women were not going to be allowed to progress very high in the hierarchy of the bank. And then she was a teacher briefly. She then hears a lecture on geology, which prompts her to go to Stanford, which we'll talk about in a minute. Herbert Hoover has an older sibling, Theodore, always known as Tad in the family, and a younger sister, Mary, always known as May. He was orphaned since his father passed away when he was 6. And then his mother, who was very active in the Quaker Church, died when he was 9. So May went to live with her maternal grandmother out by Sioux City. Tad went to live with a family member in South Central Iowa. Bert stayed in the area, lived with a family member just north of West Branch here for a while. The school teacher wanted to adopt him, but the family refused because she was not married. And eventually, his uncle, who had been in West Branch for a while but moved out to Oregon, he lost his son. So he asked the family if Bert could come out and live with them. So at age 11, Bert gets on a train with a local Quaker family that was going out to Oregon as well, and went to live with his uncle. And they moved briefly, shortly thereafter, to Salem. Bert did not go to high school. He did take a couple of business school classes after graduating grammar school, and did some work in the Oregon Land Company there for his uncle. They were trying to set up and establish Quakers in the Willamette Valley out in Oregon. And their house is a museum today. Lou is a very engaging and interesting person. I didn't know anything about her when I started here 20 years ago. But when she was 15 years old, she writes this essay about being an independent girl. And as it says here, the independent girl is a person before whose wrath only the most rash dares stand. And it must be confessed, with much fear and trembling. That photo, she's, I think, 16 or 17, out in California. She is holding a rifle. She collected weapons. We have a number of the weapons she collected in our museum collections here. Bert ends up, he takes the entrance exams to get into Stanford, which actually even hasn't opened yet. They're building the buildings, and he fails the initial test. The Joseph Swain, who was the proctor and a Quaker, was actually pretty impressed with how well Bert did, considering he hadn't been to high school. So he suggested that Bert go down to Palo Alto and get tutored over the summer and try again. So when he took the exams again in the fall, he passed everything except English. So he was enrolled as a student with a condition in English, which meant they had to have a paper the English department approved of before he could graduate. While he was there was the first Stanford Cal football game, which is not unlike Iowa State here as far as its local emotional impact, I guess. And part of the reason he was able to go to Stanford was Stanford had lost his son and there was no tuition. It still cost for housing and lab fees and books and such, but it became affordable, and it was one of the first universities to have uh, a bunch of sorry about the phone, guys. Anyway, so it was no so there were a lot of middle class at the time. It was primarily colleges were for um, sort of the sons and occasionally the daughters of wealthy people. But Stanford had a bunch of middle class students who were attending, and the more wealthy students nicknamed them the barbarians. And Hoover's circle of friends decided, hey, wait a minute, there's more of us than them. So they sort of adopted the pejorative name barbarian and called themselves the Barbarian Party, and were elected to overwhelmingly into office. And Bert did serve, was elected treasurer. He wasn't elected till another office until he became president. When he was elected to president, he only served one term as treasurer because he spent so much time focused on that his grades were suffering. So he decided to refocus on making sure he got his grades. As last year there, J.P. Smith, one of the professors, said, you are the star of the geology department. Here's the best paper that you wrote while you were here. Please take it home over the weekend, correct your spelling and grammar errors, and we'll take this to the English department and get that taken care of on Monday. When Bert showed up on Monday and Professor Smith saw the paper, he sort of shook his head and went into his office and corrected it himself. There's also an anecdote about some of the students making fun of Herbert Hoover for not being more sort of academically gifted. And the professor actually chastised them and said, actually, Herbert Hoover does all of his work, which is more than I can say for you. And 90% of success in life is from actually doing the work. Lou, as I mentioned earlier, she heard a lecture on geology and decided, since her first two ideas for her career weren't working out as she hoped, she decides to go to get a second degree and enter Stanford University as the first female in their geology department. And there's some pictures of her at Stanford. After Bert graduates, he actually gets a job. At the time, the center of the mining world was London, England. And Bert gets a job. The picture here, the firm in England, Baywick Mooring, was looking for a mid-career person with 10 years of experience. And Bert was had about 6 months of experience and was maybe 23 or 24 at the time. So he got this very nice suit, and he grew the facial hair there to appear older than he was, which did not fool them when they gave an interview, but he had a very nice letter of recommendation from a mining engineer in California with an international reputation, and he acquired the job with Baywick Mooring. And here's a couple of quotes from that time period. Hoover's letters at this time are a little more open, and you know what he's thinking about. As he progresses within the company, he begins to be very guarded with what he's writing. And so Lou, we can get a sense of her personality, where Bert seems to be a little more cautious about what he writes, even to his family. But he talked about having a great voyage to Australia, except for sundry fistfights with English snobs. And you can see there he actually traveled by camel. It was notorious for not having a lot of water. There are stories that people, since there wasn't water to bathe in, that people would bathe in beer, which I have a hard time believing is true. So, but that is the story. And he sent his brother a boomerang because he was impressed that the natives still used them. We actually have several of the boomerangs of his from Australia in our museum collection here as well. And I mentioned Independent Girl. The sec part, a little bit later in the essay, remember she wrote this when she was 15. Uh, she says, but sooner or later, she is sure to meet a spirit equally as independent as her own. And then there is a clash of arms ending in mortal combat. Or they unite their forces and with combined strength go forth to meet the world. So her and Herbert Hoover basically take that second path. And here's a photograph of her parents' home in Monterey where they got married. Her mother was a little concerned because they were going to go to China after the wedding. So, from one of her letters to a friend, Florence writes that we had made up our minds not to like him very well as he was going to take Lou so far away. But after he had been here a few days, I think we all liked him about as much as Lou did. So, Hoover doesn't have a reputation as being very charming, but evidently when it was important, perhaps he was able to pull it off. Some pictures of the wedding day. That's Lou's sister on the left. And really, it was really just 7 people. There's Lou and Bert in the foreground on the right with her parents and sister in the background. Bert's brother, Tad, is taking that photograph. And the minister that performed the ceremony, that's all the people who were there. They got married at noon. At 2 o'clock, they went to the train station and went to spent the night in San Francisco. And on the next day, literally, they get on a slow boat to China. And at that time, it took about 5 weeks to get across the Pacific. And so actually, the picture on the right there is Lou and her sister Jean. Jean came out to visit them and they met in Japan. So the photograph on the right where they're in kimonos is in Japan. On the left, you might notice the cannon, because when the Hoovers were there, they were there during the Boxer Rebellion, and the city that they were in, and I can't pronounce this well, but Tientsin was under siege for a little over a month. And when I first started working here, what first attracted me to the idea that Lou was an interesting person. She writes her best friend after spending 4 weeks under siege and having cannon fire shot at you. She writes, "You missed one of the opportunities of your life by not coming to China in the summer of 1900. You should have been here at the most interesting siege and bombardment of the age." This sounds like a person who is pretty fearless. And we actually have diaries of their neighbors. And at the time, if you might be able to make out on the map, there's a little square. It looks like a castle. That's where the Boxers were. And there is sort of the darker orange. It's sort of an oval on the bottom part of that circle is where the siege was. Those were all the foreigners. And they would shoot cannonballs in there, usually always in groups of 3. They might be 30 seconds apart or 2 minutes apart, but always 3 would be shot. And in that diary, the neighbors, after the first cannonball exploded, Lou went out into the courtyard to see what was going on, and her neighbors sort of told her she needed to go back inside until the other 2 shells had landed. And the place that they were living in China actually had the front porch blown off by a shell at one point. So pretty, well, obviously Lou was very excited by it, but that sounds a little scary to me. After China, the siege is broken by a multinational force. Hoover is made a full partner in Baywick Mooring, and he now is not just in charge of the mines in Australia or China, but he has a role in all their mines all around the world. So they become world travelers. On the upper left there, you can see the Hoovers in London. At the bottom, that's their ship going through the Suez Canal. On the right, you can see Lou, who's actually swinging from the ship. Again, a lot of the photographs and letters that she write, really her personality comes through a little bit, which I think is just really amazing. They were obviously based in London. This is their first car. I don't know the model, but it is a 1903 vehicle. You'll see Lou is actually at the wheel, and she loved driving. Actually, as First Lady, she would drive herself around Washington, D.C., and the papers were occasionally had headlines about how shocked they were that women would drive themselves around the town. Um, she was also rather notorious for having sort of a heavy foot. She liked to speed. Actually, when they moved to Palo Alto, the local police knew her car and they just left her alone. At one point, one of her sons thought, oh, well, mom gets away with speeding. I'm going to be able to too. And when he took the car out, he only got a few blocks and the police stopped him and gave him a warning and said, you don't look anything like your mother. So, 1903, Herbert Jr. is born. And if you notice, since they're traveling around the world, they're on board ship, board often 4 to 6 months of the year. So Lou actually made that harness for when the kids were getting anxious and wanting to maybe go places they should that were a little more dangerous on the ship. So you can sort of see that on the right there. Actually, and she didn't just stay at home in London. So Herb Jr.'s first Christmas there in New Zealand, and Lou has a little story about how they didn't have a Christmas tree, so they stole one of the plants from the hotel and took it in their room and decorated it for Herbert Jr.'s first Christmas. In 1907, Alan is born, and her mother wrote an interesting letter where, as the first boy had his father's name, which decidedly pleased me, I think the second boy should have his mother's name. Yet I suppose I shall love him, even if he has been named John Smith. Herbert Hoover actually is a little more articulate, well, at least interesting when he's talking about fishing or boys. So here's a couple of examples where Hoover does show a little bit of a sense of humor when he's talking about a boys. These are a couple of quotes of his about a boy is a piece of skin stretched over an appetite. However, he eats only when he's awake. Boys imitate their dads in spite of all efforts to teach them good manners. And secondly, boys are very durable. Boy, if not washed too often and if kept in a cool, quiet place after each accident, will survive broken bones, hornets' nests, swimming holes, and 5 helpings of pie. The Hoovers actually translated De Re Metallica, originally published in 1556. It was considered untranslatable into English. It's sort of a fusion of Latin, and it's almost like Pidgin Latin because Latin was already sort of dying off, and German. So it's this odd mixture of sort of Latin and German. But Lou did most of the prose work. And if you notice there, there's a little wood carving there on the right. So Bert basically would try to figure out what was going on in the various wood cuttings and then explain what they meant in more modern terms. So they finished their translation in 1912 and they won gold medals from the Mining and Metallurgical Society of America. Lou is the first woman to win that medal, and I believe it was almost 80 years before another woman won that medal. And they gave speeches at the reception where the medals were presented, and Bert gave a rather long, detailed history of mining since Egyptian times. And Lou's speech tends to focus more on her and her family. And one of the amusing elements of her speech is the fact she goes, I have a small boy who a few years ago began to measure the world in terms of cups and medals. This will help most materially in adjusting the desired balance in the family. So evidently there's more respect for mom now that she's won a medal. They're in London when World War I breaks out. And one of the first things they do is they both work to try to help Americans. A lot of Americans who are in Europe at the time want to go home. And Bert works primarily to try to get some financing to sort of help with that. Lou goes to help. She goes down to the Savoy Hotel, which is the center of assistance for all of these people. And they say, oh, great, we need someone to work with women and children. So at the time, If there was a male figure, then they would just talk to the person. But there were a lot of women who were unaccompanied or just had children. And Lou and her sort of cadre of female friends and a number of women's societies in London that she belonged to all immediately began helping try to find transportation back home. For the first 2 weeks, it was really primarily just helping Americans get back. After that, you got sort of American women who had married Europeans who were just trying to get away from the war. And so Lou and her circle of friends essentially found jobs and housing in London for them so that they could try to weather the war in London more safely than at the front lines. And when you look at both of the reports of the work that they did during this time period, which is really just about a month, but they do have some kind of direct interactions with about just under 10,000 people that they assisted. And I have a little quote here from Lou's report where she talks about there were 3 little girls under 15 from a Belgian convent who are having a romantically exciting time, and the lone little one of 12 whose wide, terror-filled eyes had seen more of war than a little girl should. And after that month is up, it sort of transfers from helping Americans get back to the United States to the Commission for Relief in Belgium. At this point in time, the United States is not in the war, they're neutral. 80% of Belgium's food was imported. And so Hoover helps negotiate with the British and the Germans and creates sort of one of the prototype NGO to provide food to Belgium and occupied France. So he helps feed sort of millions of people over the next few years, and basically gets the sort of international reputation, which reflects on him, but also the United States as being willing to help out people in need. At that time, Lou joins officially the Girl Scouts of America, and she spends the rest of her life involved with the organization in one level or another. She claimed that she was a Girl Scout before there were Girl Scouts. So obviously, their activities sort of fit her desires to have girls be physically active and engaging in outdoor activities. When the United States enters World War I, they're no longer neutral. So Hoover comes back, and President Woodrow Wilson asked him to head up the United States Food Administration, which is trying to conserve food and get food over to Europe, I guess partially for the soldiers, but also for the civilians in areas that need it, especially as they're liberated. And he becomes so effective, Hooverize becomes a word in popular culture, and to Hooverize is to conserve materials, whether it be food or gasoline or what have you. And it's a little corny, but up in the corner there's a Valentine. It says, "To my Valentine, I can Hooverize on dinners and on lights and fuel too, but I'll never learn to Hooverize when it comes to loving you." So there's also poems by kids who sort of unhappy that many of there are over 2 million children signed pledges not to eat meat on Mondays and wheat on Wednesdays. So occasionally there's some popular cultural stuff where they're poking fun at Hoover for having to not eat as they would like to. After the war is over, Hoover helps again in food relief in post-war Europe through the auspices of the American Relief Association, which at first helps feed Central Europe. And as the next couple of years go by, there's a rather large Russian famine, Soviet famine in Russia and Ukraine. And they help feed, again, millions of people who are at risk. some photographs of, this is my undergraduate degrees in Russian studies. I have particular interest in some of the images from the Russians who are benefiting from getting food. Hoover, and this is my opinion, but I think Hoover seems to always have a special place in his heart for children. I suspect because he was orphaned, but he's associated with a number of groups that are designed to sort of help children, and they sort of combined into the American Child Health Association in 1922. And Herbert Hoover is the president. And some of the taken from one of his speeches is they come up with it's called the Child's Bill of Rights, and he thinks that every child in the United States is entitled to certain things, and we're working on some of them today. I know it says no child should ever suffer from undernourishment and have prompt and efficient medical attention. Some of these things we probably could still work on a little bit, but and actually, when he becomes president, he actually has a conference on children's health, and they're more elaborate measures come out of all the people get together to sort of figure out how to help children in the United States. Lou becomes extremely active in women's athletics. You can see here from some of the headlines that she's promoting better health and fitness. An organization forms called the National Amateur Athletic Federation. Lou goes down to talk with the board to see if they're doing anything for women, and they said yes, as long as you're willing to head it up. So she's in charge of the women's division of the National Amateur Athletic Federation. Within a few years, the men's side actually goes bankrupt. Lou's great at raising money, so the women's division continues until the early 40s, when it combines with some other women's athletic groups to so she's just, it's one of the things, as well as the Girl Scouts, those are two of the big passions that Lou has in her personal work. 1923, Hoover actually writes a book called American Individualism, which really is sort of crystallizes some of his ideas about what makes America exceptional, I guess you would say. It's been often sort of misquoted or misunderstood as rugged individualism, which is sort of like every person for themselves. Herbert Hoover said, no, actually, one strong element of American individualism is we need to help people who need help. And what it's really based is, as it says here, we want to safeguard to every individual equality of opportunity to take the position in the community to which their intelligence, character, ability, and ambition entitle them. So he wants to remove any barriers from people becoming as good as they wish, as through their hard work and intelligence. And anyways, it's a short little book, but it's got some, I think, interesting ideas that I suspect would get support from both sides of the aisle. I mean, who's against people being able to come all they can be? He actually runs for president in 1920. He is actually being recruited by both the Democrats and the Republicans. He has not been political and does not belong to a political party yet. And I think because of his work in Europe during the war, he is very supportive of the League of Nations. I suspect if either the Democrats or Republicans had come out in support of the League of Nations, he would have basically, that's the party he would have chosen. Neither party did. So late in March, he finally declares himself to be a Republican. But one of the interesting what ifs of history is, here's, I have a quote from a letter that Franklin Roosevelt wrote in 1920 saying, I had some nice talks with Herbert Hoover before he went west for Christmas. He is certainly a wonder, and I wish we could make him president of the United States. There could not be a better one. Now, that's not going to be Roosevelt's opinion in 1932 when they're running against each other, but it's an interesting what if. And there's even a proposal that if Hoover would be a Democrat, that maybe he could be the Democratic nomination for president, and Roosevelt would have been his vice president. So again, sort of an interesting what if scenario for history. Now, elections were a lot more decentralized than people are used to today. So I grew up in Michigan, and at the time he was on both primaries for the Democrats and the Republicans in Michigan. He ended up coming in fourth in the Republican primary and first in the Democratic primary in Michigan. And here's the ballots that you would have used at the time if you were voting in the primaries in Michigan. Both Bert and Lou, they did many joint projects, but they also had their own unique projects to themselves. I have fun sometimes pointing out that Lou Henry Hoover made the cover of Time magazine before Bert did, with her work with a women's group that was looking into law enforcement. We do have a couple of videos here. They were both into technology.
On April 7th, 1927, the telephone was 51 years old. In a New York auditorium, a handful of people were given a glimpse of the future. It was called television. The show, if you could call it that, originated in Washington, D.C. and starred Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce. This first crude transmission was the work of engineers from Bell Laboratories. They had invented the transmission system not for the sake of entertainment, but to learn more about long-distance networks. At the time, few people realized just how successful the experiment would turn out to be. Today, the phone company is still deeply involved in television. In fact, the network shows you enjoy, including the one you're watching now, are brought to you through the facilities of the Bell system. In the 100-year history of the telephone, there have been many important moments. This has been one of them.
Well, Bell Labs is not actually the reason you're listening to me today. This program is brought to you by the State Historical Society of Iowa. Thank you very much. Hoover gets catapulted in the national limelight. There's a large flood of the Mississippi in 1927. Over 600,000 people are displaced from their homes. The governors of those 7 states ask for federal assistance. There is no FEMA at the time. And Herbert Hoover, partly because all of the sort of logistical work he's done in his career already, comes and helps organize relief in the South at this flood. And that sort of gets him, like I said, in the limelight. And so when he runs for president in 28, he sort of wins by a landslide. You can start to see on the left there's a picture that's similar from the same setting as the first one at the beginning of the show, where it's pulled back a little bit. And then on the right, you can see Bert and Lou at the White House. His son gets tuberculosis. And so now there's 3 children instead of just 2, and they actually move into the White House. And I think are the first young children in the White House for quite several decades. So the press sort of really pays a lot of attention to having children in the White House, including there's a little piece here from one of the newsreels the day.
Come on, hey Glenn. Hey Glenn. Come on, boy. Okay. Hey Glenn. Hey Glenn. Now don't go down there.
I think there's raw footage that didn't make it in. Now, I mentioned they love technology, and the closest we ever got to getting a real buzz in social media is we discovered that there was a technology around for a little while which had color moving images. The film itself was not colored, but here's a little promotional piece that the National Archives made when this was hitting the news from our collection. Sorry about that. There we go. All right. One of the things the Hoovers did was create Rapidan Camp, which is actually part of a national park system, Shenandoah National Park, I believe. And they paid for all this stuff. The only government money that went into it was the military guys actually constructed thing. Lou sort of helped design this with an architect. She was very concerned. As you might see in the upper left there, there's trees. She didn't want any trees cut down. They've been incorporated into the design itself. And they would often go to Camp Rapidan for the weekend. And actually, they hosted the Lindberghs. They hosted there also. The Prime Minister of England, Ramsay, he had his daughter with him, where she actually learned to play horseshoes when she was at Rapidan Camp. And when they got back to England, they had to put in a horseshoe thing for her to work to play with when she got back to England. And when Hoover gave this to the people of the United States when he left office, assuming that it might still be used by future presidents, unfortunately, it was not really wheelchair accessible at all. So Franklin Roosevelt was not able to take advantage of that, and essentially created what became Camp David today. But I do know, I believe Nixon and Carter and some of the presidents had gone up there. We've worked a little bit with the National Park Service. I believe it's about an hour trip from their visitor center. So they like to have anecdotes to tell on the trip on the bus to get up to where the camp is. And Hoover just loves fishing, and this is sort of a cute. Now, normally the family movies do not have sound, of course, at the time. And there's Peggy Ann, Margaret, but the family color Peggy Ann, learning to fish with her grandpa. And this is just an excerpt. When she actually catches that fish, I think Lou is taking it because it shakes dramatically, because I think she's clapping that her granddaughter caught a fish. Now, here's the thing where preservation. So you can sort of see, look closely there. Oh, the arm went through the tree there. Well, that because the film had snapped, and then when they fixed the film, they lost the little frame that showed their arms about moving apart. Hoover is very eloquent, I think, for the most part, when he's talking about children or to children, and fishing and peace. He was also a person who was a big supporter of peace. And anyway, so here's a cut. He has a really interesting little collection of sayings about fishing. And one of my favorites is the discipline and the equality of men. All men are equal before fish. It doesn't matter what your religion or how rich you are. You know, you're all trying to catch them and eat them. But he's very, and also I think he, some people call him shy. I don't think he was shy. I don't think shy people want to become president. I think he was an introvert, which just means that you recharge your batteries by being alone, not being around other people. So fishing fits perfectly when you want to recharge your energy. Again, Lou continues with the Girl Scouts. She has Troop 8 in Washington, D.C. while she's First Lady. She often gets them involved in events. She wants the young women to be exposed to VIPs and get comfortable in situations they might not normally be allowed to be in, so that they might be able to, again, achieve all that they can be once they're realize, hey, I can be around famous and important people, and it works just fine. So she also gave some. She did the number. I believe she was the first lady to do some radio speeches as first lady, and there's one particularly notable one where she talks about the efforts of the Girl Scouts to help in whatever ways they can to mitigate some of the suffering in the Great Depression. Hoover was, they were concerned about his physical fitness, so they create something called Hoover Ball. The World Championship is here every August. It's sort of like, you can see there, volleyball, but instead of a light ball, you use a medicine ball, which is 6 pounds. So you don't want to spike one of those things. You might break your arm. But it was, and you'll also notice that this is out in the White House lawn. As part of his morning ritual, Hoover would get up and they would play Hoover ball. But they call this the medicine ball cabinet. So some of the cabinet members would go out, and this was their physical exercise in the morning before breakfast. And we also have a film of ladies. I think their ball was 4 pounds instead of 6, but they aren't really dressed appropriately. I suspect it may have been just for publicity's purposes, but anyway. And also, if anyone's interested in this at all, if you did a YouTube search, there's a lot of high school gym classes that play Hoover ball. So I was surprised to find that out when I did a random search one day, and I found that a number of phys ed classes use this for exercise to this day. I would say 32, he gets on the campaign trail again. On the left there, you can see sort of an archetypical, some of you might be aware of the old politics worked in the old days. They would go around on trains and give speeches from the train. On the right there, it's actually from 1930, it's not from 32, but it's the only public display of affection I've ever seen recorded in our collections. And Lou had been out doing stuff away from Bert for a week or 10 days or so. And this is, as soon as she returned, even though there were photographers around, evidently Bert couldn't resist giving her a kiss on the cheek in public. After he left office, one of the major things he helped do was at the end of World War II, they established the Famine Emergency Committee to try to help mitigate food shortages around the world. And Hoover does a world tour, followed by a tour of sort of Central and South America, and sort of helps do the logistical planning. Truman asked him to come in to help out, and this hopefully was intended to get bipartisan support for helping feed the world after World War II. Actually, on the trip, it was originally going to be just Europe, and he got to Cairo, and Truman asked him to come back. He's concerned about support for this idea, and he wants Hoover to come back and give a speech to Congress to try to shore up bipartisan support for it. Hoover's not interested in that. He wants to continue through Asia. And you got two presidents, loggerheads there. So the compromise was, why don't I give a radio speech from Cairo? So Truman got the speech he wanted that people could hear, and Hoover was able to continue his trip through Asia, where he met, among many others, Gandhi and Douglas MacArthur. Long stories about Douglas MacArthur. I don't have time today, but Hoover and him were sort of friends. And at the time, Douglas MacArthur's in charge of what's going on in Japan, occupied Japan after the war. So Hoover meets with him. These are just a couple of images of trying to help the situation after the war and feeding kids again. I call it the World Tour Mission of Mystery, and here's some quotes from Maurice Pate, who was on that trip and would become director of UNICEF, and basically mentions how important this was and what was gained by helping feed 38 countries around the world. And one of the things is American leadership, not merely slogans for a world on the brink of starvation. And so, yeah, he also is involved after he leaves office. In some ways, he and Jimmy Carter are very active in their post-presidencies because the federal government had gotten so enlarged, during World War II. There were efforts to sort of streamline. They actually got nicknamed the Hoover Commission, and they were trying to sort of pull back the size of the federal government as much as they could. And I know in the Hoover Commission under Truman, Congress adopted, I think, 76% of their recommendations to help make the government a little bit smaller. He does another one under Eisenhower, but that isn't quite as successful. And we have some words of Hoover himself about. This is after the Central and South America.
Back to Washington comes Herbert Hoover. The 71-year-old former president, now honorary chairman of the Famine Emergency Committee, completes his 25-day survey of food supplies in Latin America. And with new supplies promised, he has words of hope on the fight against famine overseas.
The result of the whole of 3 months has been to find a fine cooperation throughout the world, a willingness to sacrifice, and a complete devotion to the fact that human life has never been so endangered as at the present moment. I believe we shall obtain the mastery of this famine if we can maintain this devotion for another 3 months.
All right, well, there's the nickel tour. I have plenty of other stories, but I want to leave some time for questions here. If anyone has follow-up questions, not today, I have my email up there, or if they would like maybe copies of either some of the photographs or documents, you can email me and I can get a hold of you. On the left there, we have the grave site, which is on the site here, looking down. You can't really tell where the library is in the background, but Hoover in his asked that his site of his birthplace cottage not be blocked, and so that you can see his birthplace cottage from the gravesite. And then there was an artist who came in who did a statue of Lou in Waterloo, and I thought extremely creative. You can see on the right side there, the statue has two versions. They have Lou as an adult with a basket of bread, and on the other reverse, you see her as a little girl with her dog. So with that, I turn it over to Jess for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Craig. That was really interesting, and I especially enjoyed seeing the Kodacolor and the newsreels. We have time to answer just a few questions. And as a reminder, if you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A feature on Zoom. Please note that we may not be able to get to all of the questions. So Craig, we will kick it off with a Hoover and Henry childhood question, throwing it way back to almost an hour ago. You mentioned that the Henry family moved to southern Iowa, which I'm familiar with them living in both Shell Rock and Waterloo, but I wondered in what other towns did they live? And same question for the future president. When he was not living in West Branch, where else did he reside in the state of Iowa?
Well, it was the president. That's the one I'm going to try to look up the names of the cities. And I have another document that lists those. But his was really just a family farm, like just north of West Branch. So it wasn't really a city. That's the only place in Iowa. Now, yeah. So yeah, it was Shell Rock. That's the first place that in 1875 that the Henry family moved to, and then back to Waterloo. Then Corsicana, Texas, and then Clearwater, Kansas. And when they first landed in California, it was in Whittier. They moved from Whittier to Los Angeles to Monterey. So they bounced around California a little bit, but yes, they're familiar. Shell Rock is correct. That's the other Iowa city for the Henry family.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And now, do you feel like being from Iowa affected both Lou and Herbert's view of the world and their work? Did that 1874 Iowa that they both started in and the time they spent here in the Midwest shape their worldviews?
That is, unfortunately, I'm an archivist. I get to get people, here's the information, they can decide themselves. Now, personally, yeah, I think it does. I think everyone's childhood sort of reflects. And I think Bert himself, particular, being raised in the Quaker faith, you're quiet. You're not supposed to publicly show your emotions very much. And so, in some ways, Hoover was occasionally sort of, picked at for not being more public with his feelings about things. But I think that's sort of really strongly, and I also think the idea Hoover very central to his idea, like I said in American individualism, is you are supposed to help people in need. It's not, you don't let them sink or swim on their own. And I think that also comes for that. Lou, yeah, I think it's hard to know. There's not as much written about her early life, and we don't have as much stuff. I think what is important to Lou a lot was within her family dynamic, because she wrote later that she was always allowed to do whatever she wanted to. I mean, you might rephrase that today as she was not forced to any kind of gender role. And actually, a little bit of a story there. When I first got here 20 years ago, and they look up Lou Henry Hoover on Wikipedia, it said Louise Henry Hoover, which is not true. And so I wrote Wikipedia and said, hey, just thought you might want to correct that. Lou is not short for anything. Lou was her legal name. They wrote back and said they saw the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in my SIG line. They said, well, we don't take partisan politics. I'm like, I'm not being political here. I'm just telling this what her name is. So I actually scanned her passport and sent it to him, just because you're using your legal name in the passport. It was just evidence. And then they said,
Sure.
we do not take primary source documents. And I'm like, I'm not asking you to post that. But they were very hesitant. So I went home and signed up as an anonymous contributor and changed her name to Lou, and that they didn't have any problem with that at all. Now, that I'm not saying that's how it works on Wikipedia today, but 20 years ago, I was a little astonished that they ignored me until I became anonymous.
Oh, Craig, that's fantastic. Some rogue history correcting. I love it. Now, this will be our last question. You clearly have so much familiarity with the primary sources available about the Hoovers, both for Lou and Herbert. And I wondered, for those of us in attendance today, could you share what is your favorite thing we can see if we look at the Presidential Library Museum online? And what's your favorite thing we can see if we visit in West Branch? And we will wrap it up with those two answers.
Okay. Well, just so everyone's aware, if you came here, there you can look at everything. There's nothing that's restricted. Uh, these are just personal because everyone's going to have different things that
Right.
scratches their interest. But Lou has a marvelous diary of those first 2 years when she's at Los Angeles Normal School, and I just love it. She's singing. She's writing out the songs they sang at the athletic event. She talks about how her and her girlfriends are going out and collecting stuff for the museum at the school. Uh, uh, so that now online right now, really mostly what we have are photos. What I'm trying to do is try to get some of the things I've scanned, get permission from the National Archives to mount on our website, and I have stuff ready to go up, but haven't gotten the go ahead yet. So mostly what you might see on our website is photographs of folks. They're not all the ones I used in mine, so you would see some different ones. Um, for Bert, I like his letters that he writes to children. Bert wrote as many, and one of my predecessors counted, there's sometimes over 35,000 letters that were written by Hoover in a year. Well, he puts in shorthand what he wants to say, and his secretaries type it up and he signs them. But they're all mostly tend to be 1 or 2 sentence responses that are very informal. But every time he writes in response to a child, he puts something personal in it. So, one example in 1962, a young girl writes Herbert Hoover asking if he thinks there'll ever be a woman president. And Herbert Hoover says, yes. And considering what's the shape of the world over the last 37 years, this can only be an improvement. I look forward to the day that I can vote for you.
That's wonderful. That is wonderful. And with that answer and sentiment, we will bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to everyone joining us today. And we would like to extend one last thank you to Craig Wright, our presenter. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays throughout the year. We look forward to virtually seeing you for the next Iowa History 101 webinar on May 9th. The topic will be Iowa's African American Civil War Heritage. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.